society's productive members, but they also carry along with them a criminal record that permanently brands them as being people unemployable, not able to get jobs, not able to go to school, not able to rent apartments. Here's another reason to get passionate about this issue. Neil touched on this. Since December 2006, when former President Felipe Calderon of Mexico decided to escalate the war on drugs in Mexico and start cracking down on the cartels, there have now been, by some estimates, more than 100,000 Mexican men, women, children killed in direct relationship to the war on drugs, and an additional 25,000 people disappeared. That's a lot of people dying and disappearing for what is essentially a U.S. drug problem. They are people that are caught up transporting the commodities that we're demanding. So it's U.S. drug policy that is contributing to those deaths. So how do we go about doing this? I want to encourage you to think about your work in two different worlds. There's public education, and then there's politics. Here's what I mean. When the ACLU of Washington State decided that it was going to take on marijuana law reform as a priority issue, hired me on in 2006, we decided that what we needed to do was find out where are the voters of this state, what do they care about? How are they passionate about marijuana law reform? What might they want to do about our marijuana laws? And what we discovered was, first of all, it's not really a big issue for a lot of voters. They're thinking about the economy, they're thinking about transportation, they're thinking about their potholes, they're not really thinking about marijuana law reform. So we had some work to do to get on people's radars. The second thing we noticed is they didn't actually know what our marijuana laws were. Washington State passed the medical marijuana law in 1998 with 59% of the vote. In 2006, only 25% of Washington voters knew that we had a medical marijuana law. Another 25% thought we didn't, affirmatively did not. There was also a significant number of voters that thought that Washington State was a marijuana decrim state, that possession of a small amount of marijuana would subject you to nothing more than maybe paying a ticket, or it was completely legal. And in fact, until Initiative 502 passed in 2012, possession of a personal amount of marijuana was a misdemeanor crime that carried a mandatory 24 hours in jail and a mandatory $250 fine. They didn't know what was going on. So what the ACLU of Washington decided to do was to launch a public education campaign statewide to first and foremost tell people, by the way, here's what your marijuana laws are, here's what's actually going on in the state, how many people are getting arrested, how many people are getting convicted, and here's these collateral consequences that you might want to think about, the fact that, it's the white Washingtonians that are getting off scot-free while all of our black neighbors are the ones that are getting arrested. How do you feel about that? And we thought this would be a great way to get people riled up and wanting to change marijuana laws. So I went and essentially stalked Rick Steves. Some of you may know who he is. He is a travel writer, writes a series of books called Europe Through the Back Door, has TV shows, radio shows on public television, and he lives in Edmonds, which is about 20 miles north of Seattle. And so I kind of kept pestering him and saying, you know what, you would be a great spokesperson for us. We want to do this multimedia campaign where we're going to do a half-hour infomercial called Marijuana, It's Time for a Conversation. We'll have a website, we'll have a Facebook page, we'll have all these great educational materials, and we're really going to turn around the issue of marijuana law in Washington State. And so he finally relented and agreed to do it. I think he checked me out with some other things so that I wasn't insane, and came and did this program with us. And so we did all that. We had the infomercial on cable television. I think our local NBC affiliate finally sold us a slot after Saturday Night Live. They figured probably we couldn't do any damage at that hour. And then what we did is we took the show on the road. So what this is a picture of a forum that we hosted. We had 4 forums around the state, and we would show the half-hour television show, and then we would have a panel of experts on the stage engaging Q&A with the audience afterwards. And this is from, that's actually me with long hair. I've gone through about 18 different hairstyles in the last years, but that's me. And on the stage is Rick Steves on the left. That's Eagle Bud is his nickname, Crow, who was President Nixon's national drug, one of his national drug advisors. He was a deputy chief in the House of something of domestic affairs, deputy of domestic affairs, thanks, in the White House. And then Washington State Representative Mary Helen Roberts, And then this is former United States Attorney John McKay from the Western District of Washington. He was our U.S. Attorney from 2001 to 2007. He was one of the 8 U.S. attorneys that was fired by Gonzalez for essentially being too ethical. So we brought all these panelists in and we hosted this forum and talked to the audience about it. Now we would find out, we had done our public opinion research before we launched this campaign, and then we did public opinion research in 2008 after we had launched the campaign in February and wanted to see how we were doing if we were actually shifting public opinion. Here's what we learned. We learned that our fabulous multimedia campaign that we thought was so amazing was essentially preaching to the choir. That the people who would tune into our infomercial to hear about marijuana law, that would go to our website, that would check out our Facebook page, they were all already with us. That's the only reason that they cared about what we had to say about marijuana. So we weren't actually reaching the people that we needed to reach. Our public opinion research told us that there were a third of people that were already with us, way beyond us. Probably all of us in this room, or almost all of us in this room, think, yeah, let's reform our laws, let's legalize, duh, why wouldn't we? Then there's a third that you're never going to move. These are the hardliners, that if you ask them what they think about marijuana laws, they're going to say, if anything, those people should be locked up for years, and they're probably going to burn in hell, and our laws are So the people that we really have to talk to if we're going to move our marijuana laws are the people in the middle. The middle third is how we would refer to them. They're the people that aren't really thinking about marijuana that much, probably haven't used marijuana or haven't in a very long time, but they know that our marijuana laws aren't working. Their marijuana laws aren't working, but they don't know whether or not they want to change them because fear of the unknown is very powerful, right? So at this forum, I had no idea what John McKay was going to say. I had worked cases as a defense attorney against some of his staff, and I had a sense that his office had a fairly reasonable policy when it came to marijuana. And I asked him, all right, Mr. McKay, what do you think about our marijuana laws and what you've heard tonight? And he said, I think that our marijuana laws are an unmitigated disaster, that they need to be rethought and rewritten from top to bottom. And of course, I breathed a huge sigh of relief at that point. But I was also very relieved to know that there were reporters in the audience that would carry his message, they would report on his message, and that we finally, as we would see in the coming years, got some traction with that middle third. That the middle third finally were interested in what was being said because, wait a second, a U.S. attorney who was prosecuting marijuana cases, who's going after the people who are smuggling marijuana in from British Columbia, who are growing marijuana in our national parks and forests, in houses, renting out suburban homes and filling them with marijuana plants. He thinks that our laws aren't working. He thinks we ought to change our laws. That's interesting. So we continued working. We finished out that campaign. We started working with the state legislature, and we introduced a marijuana decriminalization bill in 2009. We worked with legislators to introduce it. So we were going to take misdemeanor marijuana possession down to a civil infraction with a fine attached to it. We started working that in the legislature and started getting some traction around marijuana law reform, started getting some mainstream attention. And we did additional polling. We were looking at 2012. You're going to hear me talking a lot about polling, and we're moving now to the strategies of the campaign, because here's the key difference between the public education campaign and the politics. It's about timing. So with the public education campaign, you're really trying to teach people the truth, right? When we were talking about what our marijuana laws are and what the devastation is and the racism and how this is having a negative impact, that's all information that we want people to take in. But when you want people to actually vote on a law, or when you want your legislators to move a bill at a certain time, in a certain time frame, you have to focus on what matters to them. Sometimes that's not the people that are dying. Because honestly, and this was a really hard thing for me to have to stomach, they think, well, they wouldn't be dying if they weren't involved with drugs, right? They don't care so much about students losing their federal financial aid, because if you just didn't smoke marijuana, then you wouldn't be risking your federal financial aid. The individual right to get high ranks really, really low with your average voter and with a politician. They could not care less about your hedonistic desire to have a good time. Mind you, they're saying that as they're sipping their martini, make no mistake, but hypocrisy, right? But consistency of philosophy is not a strong suit with a lot of politicians. So, you have to know where your votes are, whether it's the votes of the people or the votes of your legislators. You have to know where they are, what they care about, and you have to pitch your message to them. So voters are very cool towards marijuana, meaning when you ask them a question in public opinion, on a scale of 0 to 100, give me the number that tells me whether you have warm feelings, positive feelings about what I'm about to ask you, or cold feelings, you don't like this thing. And when you do a public opinion survey, you'll ask a whole range of things. You'll test Obama, you'll test Obamacare, you'll test your governor, you'll test a whole range of whatever current issues are, and then you'll throw marijuana on that survey and just sit, in that list and see where people come out. People feel somewhere between 24 and 38% positive about marijuana. They don't really like it, but they really believe that our marijuana laws are not working. As long ago as, I think, 2006, the Zogby poll told us that not only just marijuana, but 76% of Americans thought that the war on drugs was a failure. That's equally true for marijuana. The number one message that resonated for voters in Washington State was the waste of police resources. That they're really concerned about being safe. They're really concerned about not being victims of violence. And every minute, every hour that a police officer spends on a marijuana case is an hour or a minute that that police officer could have been spending solving a violent crime, or better yet, preventing it from happening in the first place. They also like new revenue, and so do politicians. They love new tax revenue, right? And especially if that new tax revenue is a sin tax, right? That's one that a person who doesn't smoke marijuana doesn't have to pay. It's only the person that chooses to use marijuana that has to pay that sin tax. So that's great. That means I can get the benefits of new tax revenue without actually necessarily having to pay it. And voters also like the idea of taking money away from the bad guys, right? For me, it's the cartels. Whether, as our federal government statistics have said, whether it's between 20% of the cartel profits or 60% of the cartel profits, marijuana makes up a big piece of that. The reality is marijuana is sort of the bread and butter for a lot of cartels, right? It's easy to grow, pretty easy to get. Okay, I have to sideline this. I love this story. So, we spent billions of dollars putting up this really high-tech fence between the U.S. and Mexico, and put a lot of Customs and Border Patrol people down there to make sure that we were catching all the people that were trying to smuggle marijuana in from Mexico through tunnels and all these really fancy ways, right? So we have the infrared goggles and the whole 9 yards. There's this great article in, I think it's in the New York Times, it was done in the New York Times, and it was talking about cocaine trade, how the cocaine trade works. But they interviewed a federal law enforcement officer who, of course, remained anonymous, didn't want to reveal who he was, who said, this kills me. We spent all this money to build this fence. We have all this high-tech equipment down there. And we found them catapulting bales of marijuana over the fence. They were using medieval technology to beat our fence. And it was so perfect. It just goes straight back to what Neil was talking about, how if there is demand, there will be supply. We're talking about an economic transaction here. The criminal justice system is really poorly equipped to deal with this system. All right. Here's the message that we found works, right? It's not about individual liberty. It's not about the racism. It's not about mass incarceration. It's simply this. What we've been doing is failing. It's time for a new approach. Simple, clean, it's kind of hard to argue with that, right? You get to keep coming back to the opposition and saying, so you want the status quo, because you think the status quo is working so well, right? That's your solution, is just keep doing what we've been doing. No, we're going to do something different. But because voters are nervous about changing the law and whether it's actually safe to change the law, and then what that law is going to look like once you change it, you have to have the right spokespeople. So we were very diligent about recruiting the messengers that we knew could carry our messages most convincingly. Believe it or not, a former criminal defense attorney who's now an attorney working for the ACLU is not necessarily the most convincing person to assure the middle third that changing our marijuana laws will be safe and that I have their best interests at heart. I had to acknowledge that it would probably be better to have a former U.S. attorney carrying that message. So we were really grateful that he would do this for us. And I want to take a break from the PowerPoint for just a second to show you what was basically the most potent ad in the campaign.
As the former chief federal prosecutor, I enforce marijuana laws. I've come to believe they don't work. Filling our courts and jails has failed to reduce marijuana use, and drug cartels are pocketing.
Here, do it again. No, that's fine.
As the former chief federal prosecutor, I enforce our marijuana laws. I've come to believe they don't work. Filling our courts and jails has failed to reduce marijuana use, and drug cartels are pocketing all the profits. It's time for a new approach. Initiative 502 brings marijuana under tight regulatory control, generates new revenue for education and prevention. And if we pass 502, we'll have more resources to go after violent crime instead. Yes, on 502.
Okay, so just a moment of levity, but when we were filming that ad, it was hilarious. The producer of the ad, the media consultant, he'd take the shoot, he'd be very serious, doing really gentle coaching with John and all that, and then he just turns around to me, he breaks character, he's like, he's had a freaking central casting, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous. That we were that lucky to have John agree that he would do the ad. It's kind of fun. So John's able to carry the public safety message, right? So what he's able to say is that this is safe, we're going to be taking money away from criminals, we can do a better job enforcing our laws and preventing violent crime. But that doesn't address the question of, so what is the new law going to look like? How is this going to work? I hear you saying that we're not going to continue doing what we've been doing, and we're going to make these policing resources available for violent crime, but so what's the other side going to look like? And specifically, is youth use going to go up? Is there going to be more mayhem on our roads, more mayhem in our workplaces? So the other messengers that we needed to recruit for the campaign were people from the medical fields, public health, prevention and treatment, and people who could say that the way that we drafted the initiative was tight and strategic and promised at least as good outcomes, if not better outcomes, as Prohibition had produced. Of the new tax that we attached to marijuana, we divvied up, we dedicated the taxes to healthcare, youth drug prevention, marijuana public health education, evaluation, and importantly, research. One of the most important features in Initiative 502 is that it calls for independent, periodic, cost-benefit evaluation. In our case, we designated the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, which is a policy think tank created by the state legislature that is internationally recognized actually for the quality of its cost-benefit evaluation. We wanted to be able to say to voters, this is a very conservative, tightly regulated step in a new direction that we're going to be monitoring and evaluating, and if we need to change course down the road, we'll be able to. So we're not taking the wheels off and going full speed. So here's what happened. I told you earlier that it was a 56 to 44% vote, but what was really astounding about it is that we shredded what's called the Cascade Curtain, meaning in the state of Washington, essentially west of the Cascades sort of run along the edge of Whatcom, Skagit, Snohomish, King. Cascade Mountains run down that way. West is much more liberal, east is much more conservative. Normally with progressive ballot initiatives in the state of Washington, you'll see them take Snohomish, King, Pierce, Thurston, San Juan's, right around the Puget Sound area, essentially. Political consultants will tell you if you stand at the top of the Space Needle, all the votes that you need surround you. We went over into Ferry, Okanagan, Spokane, Whitman. We took 20 of 39 counties with a message that was reassuring, right? It wasn't a message of freedom. It wasn't a message of, it was kind of a historic change, but really, people were scared of historic change. People were scared of going first. I think that dynamic is changing, which is great, but be aware that if you're in a state that has a more conservative voting population, reassuring people that what you're doing is okay, that it's safe. It's very important. These are results of a survey that we did after the vote to find out why voters voted the way that they did, to see if what we thought worked as messages actually did work as messages. These are open-end reasons. That means that the person conducting the survey simply asked, what are the specific reasons that you voted yes to approve Initiative 502 and make marijuana legal for adults in Washington? And again, no prompt. This is just what they said back. Going after dangerous criminals and freeing up police in jail, right at the top. As was tax revenue. People love money, love money. Current laws haven't worked. Again, just going back and hitting people over the head, status quo is not working, status quo is not working. Interestingly, there are some people who think that the same as alcohol or less harmful than alcohol message is a compelling one. And our research suggested that that was not the case. Our research before the vote suggested that that was not the case. And we did some focus groups around this too. And what we found is that it's sort of like telling people, well, knives are safer than guns, right? Neither sounds really great. If you say marijuana is safer than alcohol, for a lot of people, especially people who have alcoholics in their family, you are evoking a very negative sentiment. They don't necessarily have great feelings about alcohol. When you compare marijuana to alcohol, they start comparing the potential negative repercussions of either substance. And it sort of kind of prompts the opposition argument that we hear a lot, which is alcohol is bad enough, why would we want to add another intoxicating substance, right? So it might be counterintuitive because logically, absolutely that's a winning argument. We know scientifically, without a doubt, cannabis is much, much, much safer than alcohol. But it's not necessarily a message that resonates with your voters. So I suggest to you that that message is one that you might want to put into the toolbox of public education and not necessarily in the toolbox of political action if you're trying to move a marijuana measure in the near term. Just something to think about. Missouri voters may be very different than Washington state voters, but be aware of that and think about it. People need it for medical reasons. Didn't rate high on this survey, but if you ask people about medical marijuana, they support it very, very strongly. I think because we were asking them specifically about Initiative 502, and it was clear during the campaign we were not talking about it being a medical marijuana measure. We wanted no one to think that we were trying to deceive them into voting for 502 because it was a medical marijuana measure. That may be why medical reasons didn't pop up for them when they were being asked about Initiative 502. In comparison to other things that were on the ballot in Washington State, 502 with 55.7, Obama just got 56.16. It only did half a point better than 502 in Washington State. R74 was the marriage equality initiative that was on the ballot at the same time. It did 2 points less than 502, and our governor came in 4 points under, our Democratic governor, Inslee came in 4 points under 502. People were ready for this. This is interesting. Those of you that may be familiar with the Colorado campaign and the Washington campaign and differences between the two will note that there are some key differences in the demographics. We went with a very conservative message, a message of regulatory control, tight control, law enforcement officers and public health professionals. So you note in a couple of key demographics with Republicans, for example, people that self-identify as Republicans. In Washington, we got 39% of them compared to 26 in Colorado. With the 18 to 29-year-old set, Colorado got 69 versus 57. With seniors, 65 and plus, Washington got 45 compared to 32 in Colorado. What's interesting about that for you to think about is what is your voting demographic going to be if you're talking about an initiative? What is your voting demographic going to be in the year that you're going to have your initiative on the ballot? Is it going to skew more conservative because it's not in a presidential election year? If so, you might want to think about how you're messaging about it because you're going to need to focus on those older and more conservative voters. Finally, I want to come back to the New Jim Crow. How many people here know what the New Jim Crow is? How many people have read it? Good. Okay. You should. You really should. If you care about marijuana law reform, if you care about what's happening in the criminal justice system, you really need to. During the political campaign, it was very disheartening for us that every time that we tried to make the argument that our marijuana laws are racist and we need to change them, we would get a lot of pushback. I think people don't like it when you push that emotional button that suggests that they might be racist. But Michelle Alexander, not only does she make an amazing argument about how our current mass incarceration has replaced the Jim Crow laws, that essentially the victories of the civil rights era have been eroded since then by a focus on incarcerating people, those numbers that went way up in the early slide. Because now that we can't discriminate against you based on the color of your skin, that's now illegal. What we'll do is we'll hang a criminal conviction on you because that will allow us to discriminate against you in an entirely legal way, right? It's entirely legal for me to discriminate against you for jobs, education, housing, if you're a criminal. I might not be able to do it because you're black, but I can do it if you're a felon or a misdemeanor. So she makes the case very articulately. She also acknowledges that it's the money issue that will make it easier for reformers to achieve reforms in the near term. But she immediately then says, if we rest on that, if we rest all of our strategy on that, then when the money comes back, right, we're still in a little bit of a recession now, but when the money comes back, we'll just go back to doing what we were doing before. Until we actually acknowledge the roots of how it is that some people get to smoke marijuana with impunity while others cannot, we will be doomed to repeat the same failures that we experienced before the civil rights era. And then we need to embrace what's actually happening among the different people in our nations. So while you can't necessarily make that part of a political campaign, it might not work to make that part of a political campaign, you can, as the ACLU is doing now, through implementation of Initiative 502 and continuing the conversation about Initiative 502, insist that these issues get brought up again and again and again, right? So I encourage you to do so. And I think with that, I'm done. Thank you.
All right, well, we have another speaker actually real quick. Now, AMU Normal and SCCP work specifically on the AMU campus and in the city of Columbia. But we also work with Show Me Cannabis Regulation Group, who is working on a statewide basis in the state of Missouri. And we have the executive director, John Payne, here, who would like to say a few words.
Thanks everybody who came out tonight. I just want to tell you guys a little bit about how you can get involved here in Missouri. First of all, if you text SMC to 420-420, yes, we really did procure 420-420. You can get a mobile update sent to your phone. We send out an update about once a week, and most of those are usually concentrated on local things that are going on in your area. Sometimes there's something statewide, but when we have an initiative petition out, put legalization on the ballot again, we'll definitely let you know that mechanism. And then also, I think Jules going to pass around a bucket if you'd like to make a contribution to Show Me Cannabis Regulation. We'll also split it with Students for a Sensible Drug Policy and AMU Normal. If you'd like to make that contribution, just go ahead and put that in there. And that's pretty much all I have. So thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate it. It was a great turnout. Thank you.
On behalf of the AMU campus, we just want to thank again our two speakers, Neil Franklin and Allison Holcomb. And also we have some, like Jules said earlier, we have some free pen samples, and we also have some pamphlets and whatnot, and a Know Your Rights card at the front desk. And the little green card, I would recommend definitely taking because it has all your constitutional rights for dealing with police officers. And it's a business card style, so I keep it right next to my license. Thank you guys for